I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk
scripture.
about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
Remembered
invited.
at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah.
I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones or bombs and tanks, maybe. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection.
Yes, we do.
Today, Irina House joins us again. She is a willing
Victim?
victim. Yes, that's it. This time to discuss Canada, Russia, totalitarianism, and the faith. My name is Don Vino, president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is and always has been Ron Hensel, who will
Always.
introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Yeah, greetings from sunny Florida. I'm having some
You're freezing up on us there. We have the big
come
freeze
back
up.
in, but I send you greetings from sunny Florida. The big, yeah, it's starting to do that. And the funny thing is, you'll freeze up and then you'll go into like fast mode. But greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12. Are we seeing my palm trees? There they are. Okay.
We are. I see
Our
him. Yep.
sponsor for this edition, yes, our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth. And our regular legal disclaimer, our guests on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dr. Irina House, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it or it really annoys you and you would like to inflict it on someone else, to ensure your continued access, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Now, did that come through okay on your end?
Okay. And so
Okay.
here we are. We
Here
are
we are.
starting. And whether that's good or bad, I'm not really sure. But I think I'm going to send out an email while you two kind of get.
Okay. All right. Yeah, well,
just,
we're going to get this ball rolling
we're going to
here.
get this ball rolling, and we'll have a ball rolling.
So you're going to put the ball in my court? Okay.
Well, only temporarily. Doctor, I'm going to say it one more time.
Dr.
Dr.
House.
Irina House, even though she said she doesn't really want to use it, she doesn't want to get used to it yet.
Well, there is a doctor in the house here.
Is there a doctor in the house? Yes.
Yes.
Dr. House is a doctor in the house.
There are two doctors in the house.
There are two doctors in that house.
In the
that's
house.
true.
So,
Yes.
do you ever watch that TV show House about the doctor? Okay. Well,
Sadly, yes, and that's not the same guy.
no, not at all.
No, it's not the same guy.
So you
That's
are
true.
from Russia. We've heard of that place. It's in the news a lot these days.
Yeah, it's been in the news a lot lately.
I know it's a pretty cold place, but it's pretty hot right now. So
Oh yeah. It's a hot topic.
It's unfortunate as well, but I am from the former Soviet Union. That's right, USSR, or as we used to say, it's Союз Советских Социалистических Республик. Try that.
Better you than me.
Yeah, I apologize for my lighting. As I was explaining earlier, since we've moved, I've been sacrificing my office as the last man standing. That was my next project, so hopefully next time we'll have a little bit better lighting. Well, yes, that kind of sums it up. I'm from Russia, so what do you want to know?
What do you want to know?
Here's what we want to. Here's what we want to. Where we want to start, because as you are aware, when we first scheduled this, it was more to do with what was going on in Canada and how someone who was born and grew up basically in Russia views what is not just creeping totalitarianism, it doesn't seem like, but actual full-throated totalitarianism by Justin Trudeau. So let's start there before we move on to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. In your opinion, if you're living in Canada, how would you react to what we watched happen just a few months ago?
Well, I've visited Canada on a few occasions, and yes, there's that kind of a gloomy sense of socialism that manifests itself pretty much right away. Anywhere from, they can pull you over on the side of the road for no reason, which is what would happen in Russia, or in the Soviet Union and Russia. And you begin to question, well, how is it that they have a right to do so? Well, they do because they exercise their power to the fullest if they want to. And that's the mistake that unfortunately Americans make today, is that socialism is, it's just a new way of trying your life. Well, no, it's not, because socialism and totalitarianism is really on the same kind of a, linear
Same plane.
direction. And the best way to describe it is probably I wanted to quote or paraphrase a line from a movie, and that goes similar to Australia as well, where we're seeing monarchy, and that is the movie is actually a comedy, but the concept there is that you can have a lot of power in the glove of the Queen, for instance, or in this case of Trudeau, who's not a king, but nonetheless he's acting like it, and they just don't ever use it. And I think we've seen some of that with COVID, with Australia, and same situation in Canada, because they're both exercising that power now. So you're seeing the totality of it, essentially. So it is very similar in many ways when you have a monarch, when you have essentially a dictator. So I hope that makes sense.
So what year did you leave the former Soviet Union? Was it still the Soviet Union when you left?
No, actually, it was not. It was already Russian Federation, and I left in 1996. I went back in 1997, and I have traveled to Ukraine and Belarus since. So yeah, I've witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition. I actually used to live in the Ural Mountain region, and
Now, I've read that back in the 90s, and maybe even today, although it seems to me there would be very few people like this, but definitely back in the 90s, there were some people who remembered the Stalin days with wonderful nostalgia. Those were the good times in their minds. Did you ever run into anyone like that in Russia who thought, well, if we could only get back to the way it was in the 50s and the 40s, well, of course, after the war, Stalin seemed to know how to, or well, maybe the 30s before the war too. Did you ever know anyone like that? And is there if you did, is there a comparison maybe between them and people who remembered the Soviet Union from the 60s and 70s and thought those were good times?
mm-hmm. Well, the reason I'm smiling is not because I'm happy about it. The reason I'm smiling is because, yes, I did know somebody like that. That was my father.
Okay.
Oh.
Yes, he was very much a militant guy. He was a member of the Communist Party, and to him there was nothing greater than Stalin's regime. And he would work like 48 hours. He worked basically at a Soviet prison, and he's made it up in the ranking. Probably the most horrifying stories I've ever heard were coming out of his mouth, and he would often make it sound like that's just how it ought to be. He was probably the reason why I thought that I don't ever want to live in a country that forces its own people to basically, quote unquote, snitch on your neighbor, and then if you don't do it, then you end up in a type of a gulag. So, although my father loved me, he understood why I left the country. He was, toward the end, he was happy for me that I did. My mom, on the other hand, she was very much the opposite, and having the orthodox belief. They would have an ongoing conversation throughout the years because my father would actually put Stalin's portrait in our apartment. And when he would go to work, my mom would set it down, face down.
He would put Stalin's portrait. Yeah. Okay.
And
your mom didn't like Stalin.
No, and she said, "Why do you put this murderer up?" And my dad simply said, "Because he dealt with the criminals right on the spot." So it was a very black and white kind of a way of looking at it. And because my father witnessed a lot of terrible criminals, they also didn't have insane asylums as far as criminally insane. So they would have people with schizophrenia who were criminals. They were incarcerated in the same place. And a lot of that, he witnessed pretty much probably the darkest kind of criminals you can find. So I can kind of see where his reality was a little bit skewed rather than that of an average Soviet citizen. So that was my unfortunate privilege and the insight into why people, even into their 90s, in the years of 90s, still believed that Stalin's regime somehow was useful. Now, having stated that, I still think that very, very few people that actually would refer to Stalin himself as much as the time during which it wasn't political for the folks. It was just that people had a sense of camaraderie, kind of like living in a beehive, essentially. People didn't have a lot, but they didn't seem to lack a lot either. Everybody had their sack of potatoes and occasional butter. What are you complaining about, right? So,
yeah. What more do you want?
There's a Russian phrase, and it literally would be translated that they haven't seen anything sweeter than a carrot. So if you've never tried candy, and the government made sure you didn't, and again, I'm using it as a metaphor because, of course, we had a lot of candy.
You did. You had candy in Russia. Okay.
Yeah, in fact, my city had a factory where they manufactured some of the best chocolate that I've ever tried.
Ooh.
Okay. So Le Regeneres asks, what is a gulag?
It says kulak, but I think he means gulag.
It is gulag.
Gulag. There's a difference. Kulak is something we will probably talk a little bit about the history, and that goes to the history of Ukraine. Very unfortunate thing that Stalin has instituted, basically pre-Holocaust, Holocaust. But Gulag is a prison that the Soviet prison. That's where people who were political prisoners sent to by the Soviet regime, and a man by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn had written a very extensive, several-volume book basically describing the horrors of the Soviet regime and what they would do to you if you disagree with the government.
Right, Kulak Archipelago. And Les is just reminding me it was Kulak, Kulak, that he asked about.
Okay.
What is that? I don't know that word. What is that word?
So going back in history to 1917 when the Soviet Union was established as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Ukrainian side contained people that they would call them as kulaks, and Stalin made sure that he could annex the territory. I think it was toward the 1920s plus. By 1930s, he wanted to take over the land and exterminate anybody who was in his way. Kulaks were his target. So, yeah, it was a very, very dark time in history, and people don't necessarily understand, but that's part of the discussion now on a lot of people's lips, and that is the war with Ukraine and Russia, from Russia. So, having said that, Stalin, for some reason, is kind of the center of the conversation now, and yeah, obviously he's a pretty bad guy. and he did a lot of damage. He's probably done the same amount of damage, if not more, than Hitler. So the Soviet regime, of course, being the scariest thing of them all, because it was created under the guise of utopia and humanitarian, being humans being the material gods, essentially. And so there's nothing more, which leads us into the next conversation about faith, but faith in the government.
Yeah.
So that's why
Now
Stalin could behave so badly in such an evil way, because he thought he was the top.
I just want to just drop a little footnote into what you said. You just said something. You said Stalin may have been worse than Hitler. I think that's what you said, right? I mean, we think his death count was higher.
Yes.
And
I mean by saying that, yes.
Yeah, but just a couple of years ago, they were canceling people for saying that, because it's like they wouldn't even entertain the possibility. Hitler is he's our Nero, I guess. He's our all-time evil person, in the United States.
Christ and the devil, which
right? He's everything. He's all that wrapped up into one. He's Rosemary's Baby, on steroids. So you can't. It's interesting. They were canceling people for suggesting there could have been somebody worse than Hitler. Okay, well, I just want to leave that right there. We can move on. So
yeah, again, the analogy, I would say that it would be like, whom do you pick, the Antichrist or the devil? Neither is a good choice.
Right.
Both pretty evil. Of course, that's something, from a biblical standpoint, it's going to be evident in the, in the future, as we read in the prophetic material in the Bible. But from a spiritual standpoint, I do believe that Hitler and Stalin both were influenced by satanic forces.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, just visually, if you watch Hitler, he sort of starts off low, sort of boring, and all of a sudden he just ignites. Like some spirit actually took him over. He was a scary guy. Now, you mentioned something earlier about the difference between your mother and your father, and your mother was Orthodox, which sparked a thought in my mind about one of the characters who's really in the news a lot right now, which is Putin. Now, here's why it sparked that thought. It wasn't that long ago that Putin was sort of viewed kind of as a hero by some evangelicals in this sense. He stood up and forthrightly said homosexuality is wrong. He didn't buy into transgenderism. He seemed to take a good moral stand on sexuality. And so a number of Christians seem to think that if he's not a Christian, at least he's influenced morally by some Christian teaching. His mother was Orthodox, if I recall. And so when he launched this campaign against the Ukraine, it caused people to become confused. Now, certain news media outlets accused evangelicals, for example, of siding with a moral monster. I don't know that we ever did that. Ron and I, for example, or my wife, because there's other things going on in a person's life besides moral positions they might take. Do they live them out themselves is a big question.
Well, Hitler was anti-gay. Castro was anti-gay. Okay.
Absolutely. Right.
Whatever.
Yeah. So that wouldn't argue for Christianity necessarily. So how does that stack up in your view? When you look at Putin as a leader, before we talk about this whole thing going on here, in your view, is he a good leader, a moral leader, not a moral leader? Is court out on that one at the present time? You grew up kind of in a totalitarian society. In your personal opinion, how would you describe Putin?
In my personal opinion, that's a pretty load.
By the way, will this affect your visa status if you tell us exactly what you think?
I don't know. I'm a U.S.
Maybe we could disguise your identity at this point, or is it too late? I don't know. Go ahead.
Turn the light off.
We're better in the dark.
Well, let me take this stance. Since I do have psychology background, I'm going to just give an analysis from a psychological standpoint. First, I have a friend who he's very, very practical, and he oftentimes says, if your husband sometimes says something smart, just say, even a blind hog finds an acorn once in a while. So there's my segue.
Okay.
Is Putin a good leader? Oh boy, yeah, he sure is a good leader, all right. He definitely knows how to lead. The question is it good with
Where?
doing and where too?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not surprised at what's going on right now. Not in the least bit. Um, I had spent many years reading Russian news and news from all over the world. I'd read the news in Russian, addressed to the Russians. I'd read the same news from the Russian side, addressed to the West and being translated. And you oftentimes see the very separate messages, because there was an actual time when he issued an order that nothing good could be said about America in the news, for instance,
Really?
to the Russians, right, in the Russian
Okay.
language.
Hmm.
But so there was a lot of propaganda going on. You have to remember that former Soviet Union, present day Russia, the United States of America, are still very much, colloquially speaking, polar opposite in their mentality. So just by looking at somebody on TV and seeing, beautiful Orthodox churches behind, that doesn't really mean a whole lot, because we have, the White House, for instance. A person could stand on the lawn and have green trees showing up and saying he's heading out in a helicopter, when in fact the trees are still lacking leaves. Lots of stuff can be put, nowadays with our technology. And sometimes you just kind of have to laugh it off, just dealing with these issues, because when you live inside that, basically gulag mentality, you really
Right.
have to become friends with your own people. So I've always seen government and people as separate entities, and I love the Russian people, and I never understood why so much control needed from the government, because people are definitely much more pleased with the government if they have freedom, like the American experiment, which is the reason why I'm here. And
Right.
I,
And Russians, just like anybody else, know how to make good decisions for themselves
exactly,
and act responsibly toward their neighbors. So, yeah.
absolutely,
Well,
yes. There's
it's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up, because I have a friend who is from Poland, and he was born and many of his childhood years were in what was a Soviet bloc nation at the time. It became free later. And he would tell stories of his mother waking him up at 3 in the morning to take him down to the store, because she would, if she had an infant, she would get a closer place in line to potentially get groceries than someone who came in later. So uh, it changed a lot after the wall came down, obviously. And he's watching what's going on in Canada, and now what's going on with between Russia and the Ukraine, and what's going on in America, and he's very concerned. He's sort of considering, should I just go back to Poland? But well, now maybe with what's going on in Ukraine, that's not such a good idea either. So, uh, as someone who came from that situation, and someone now of faith, because you have become a Christian, how does this affect you living in America, watching us making a transition to be more like the Soviet Union?
Well, when I first came to the United States, I was pretty exhausted from just having lived in a very difficult, uh, circumstance. And for the first couple of years, I remember, this is kind of strange to think about it now, but I kind of didn't even want to think that I was a Russian. And then
Hmm.
people surrounding me, they would say, "Oh, you're from Russia. You're from Russia. Tell us more." And I was pretty traumatized, I think, just from the life of it. I did not want to talk about it. I engaged in having to, you know, study English, more and more. Although I had pretty good command by then, I was British, so I kind of, I guess, I tried to acculturate myself and associate myself with just an average American and try to blend in fact. because I just did not want to have that stigma of being a Russian. Several years have passed, and that really was just a kind of a trauma. I began to miss my culture, my people, never the government. Not that they ever miss me either, but because the Russian culture is very, very rich and it's very
Yeah.
old.
Oh, yeah.
Same with Ukraine. Ukraine is even
I
older.
mean, Tolstoy, I mean, some of the greatest novelists of all time came out of Russia, Crime
Exactly,
and
Russia,
Punish.
not the Soviet Union per se, but Russia.
Right. Before the author of Crime and Punishment, oh, his name escapes me.
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky. You have, I mean, when people say, what books would you take if you had to go and live on a desert island? What other books besides the Bible? The Brothers Karamazov is always on that list. I see it over and over again. So yes.
They're very much in-depth intellectual books. There are certain books that they're such classics that they will never cease to exist, even if people try to, which the Soviet government tried to get rid of certain books,
Mm.
to minimize the impact that people would be able to think for themselves, like you're saying. So again, back to that, yes, the culture itself has nothing to do with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is a travesty of humanity. It was, again, that concept of utopia, but the reason is because when you have a dictator who wants to control the world, which I cannot understand for the life of me, and nor do I ever want to, but we have Napoleon Bonaparte. What was that about?
Right. Yeah.
Who wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to take over the world?
I think Russia looks like prime real estate right now.
Yeah.
However, some people, once they have it in them, they have it. And as the phrase goes, if they show you who they truly are, believe them. And so I believe that current situation is definitely changing our world. The situation with anywhere from COVID, which was it whichever way it goes, it helped change the way the global society is going to be soon, because we're moving toward globalism at a very, very fast pace.
At a fast pace. So, okay, now you may have touched on this. I was kind of distracted trying to help Wayne watch.
You really try.
But so if I'm repeating something you've already said, just forgive me and pretend that you haven't talked about it before.
Okay.
But as Joy and I watch what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine, it occurs to me that among the leadership, there really aren't any good guys at the helm, either in the Ukraine or Russia. And the ones that are suffering are the citizens living in both countries,
right?
Unfortunately, who are, I think, for the most part, probably not in favor. I know Ukraine are not in favor of what's going on. I suspect many of the Russian citizens either are not getting accurate information, in which case they're deciding to side with the government because they're getting fake news, or they are, what they do know, they are not in favor of it. Do you think that we're accurate in seeing that there's really no good guys at the top, but everyone else is suffering by what they're doing?
Fed lies, of course. Of course, people fed lies. We're getting a lot of misinformation on different sides, and I do have communication with people in Russia and in Ukraine. And unfortunately, and I have relatives on both sides. So talk about heartbreak. I haven't experienced this much heartbreak since passing of my brother. And definitely this hit close to home for me. And in fact, it did hit my home because there are some people who have been terribly affected by it. No, nobody wants this. I was telling Dawn on the phone the other day, I said the best kind of a war is the kind of a war that we don't have. But that's no longer, unfortunately,
that we avoid.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other sad thing. I think that this war could have been avoided.
Oh, yeah.
There were so many different things that happened that even our administration is grateful for. And I think if you look back at the news, media, what happened to media? In 2016, Ukraine was corrupt, and now suddenly it's the hero.
Right.
It's not a black and white. It's not a black and white.
No.
So if you talk about the government, it's one thing. If you talk about the people, it's a whole different story. People on both sides, and including this country, we're fed whatever that they want us to think, to know. Now, there's a reality of war that's going on, and we have friends who barely escaped into another country as rockets were flying over their heads. So yes, we know it's real. But I've also watched with great sorrow videos of Russian soldiers being interrogated, and they're saying, "What is happening? We thought we were here to help." So talk about an absolute chaos.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately, it takes time to decipher the truth, and sometimes we just don't know the truth, and people don't want to settle on the truth. And ultimately, I want to know the truth. If you ask everyone would want to know the truth, but that's not what we're fed.
Well, okay, we're gonna part on this just for a moment to talk about a battle that is going on here in the United States.
Oh yeah.
And it really has to do with how do we really change culture? And one of our sponsors weighs in on this very question.
Yes. Have those boring family dinners become unbearably tedious? Do you wonder when someone will invent a board game that gives your life real purpose? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself while remaining the center of your universe? Then we have just what you're looking for. Where's the outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. In Where's the Outrage, there are no unfair inequality promoting dice. The rules for taking turns are simple. Each player gets points for being in an oppressed group. Turns are then taken in the order of the most points. Next, you choose a bankroller, also known as the game's George Soros. The George Soros distributes the game cards. And now you're ready to play. Each player chooses a game piece and places it in the forward space. We're going to start with Briannold. Briannold is an African-American, Native American, non-binary, transgendered former female whose pronouns are Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So Briannold gets to take the first move. Briannold decides to move to the Christian-owned bakery where Briannold takes a free lawyer's card and now can do whatever Briannold wants. So Briannold decides to occupy the space and is free to make another move. When Briannold decides to move to the free speech zone, Briannold just blows off those fascist white supremacists and their stupid free speech with an entitlements card, and the fun is just beginning on Where's the Outrage, the game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. So you really need to get this. If you really need excitement, if you really need a break from the news, just want to forget it all, okay, there's your game. So actually, there's a lot more to talk about in the news. Now, this used to be the hot topic, right? This game,
it used to be, yeah,
this
right.
used to be it. And you got to wonder if people are now rethinking the whole maybe we should be more socialist thing. I don't know. I know some people,
I wish that were the case. I don't think that they are.
I've been watching AOC's Twitter feed. She doesn't seem to have. For AOC, this is a wonderful opportunity because when we take in all these Ukrainian refugees, now we can say, well, this should just throw the door open to all refugees of anybody who wants to come in. So that's the way she's using it. But are you? I had several questions while you were talking. I want to just pick out what is the best one. Do you think? I mean, this could go in any one of a number of ways, and of course, everyone's concerned about the nuclear option, which I personally think that it's kind of overrated, especially now. Now that with the last 5 weeks of things going terribly bad for the regime in Moscow, I think they would be wise to think maybe we shouldn't go there. We're already doing bad enough already. On the other hand, you just don't know until it happens. So I'm not saying it's not a legitimate concern, but let's say let's say we're on a course now where Putin's looking for a way out, and he's looking for a way to get something out of it, and then go home and declare victory without actually taking over the whole country. No matter what he does, no matter what the outcome is, could this be the beginning of the end for him? I mean, 15, if this is correct, 15,000 Russians died. And if I understand correctly, that is more than died in Afghanistan in 9 years. And I'm thinking, how does he survive this?
Politically?
Yeah, politically.
It was definitely a very, very poor move. But this is a very hard one to answer, because when I lived back in, when it was USSR, one of the biggest, scariest things in my household was that my brother was about to be drafted, sent to Afghanistan, because there was a mandatory draft at the time. And just before it was his time to be drafted, they withdrew the troops. Well, every single person who came back from Afghanistan was completely distraught, had PTSD, lost a limb. A lot of them, of course, came back in what they call silver caskets. So that was a real scare for us. So luckily, he did not enter that, and he ended up joining the Navy instead. But what we're seeing right now has definitely quadrupled, maybe 10 times worse in terms of the casualties. And up until recently was not a mandatory draft in a very long time. Well, the talk is now that they're trying to do this mandatorily again, and that, once again, is going to be another calamity. So at what point do we stop this bloodshed? And I really do want to appeal to the people of Ukraine and Russia that the population does not want it, does not want this war. There was so much propaganda on both sides for such a long time, but also there were aspects of the truth. And I mean, if you look at it, since 2014, there were certain areas in Ukraine, East Ukraine, that were throwing, rockets in the side of Russia and vice versa. And actually, there were people in Ukraine who were basically persecuted by their own people there. So there's a certain amount of nationalism there. Yes, that's true. But for Putin to enter Kiev, the center of Ukraine, that made no sense whatsoever. And when I listened to President Zelensky's appeal to the Russian people from the very beginning, saying, we're not going to go and bomb the places like in Odessa and stuff to take out some of the nationalists. And I'm thinking, well, what is the solution to this? If you do have people in your own country who are attacking another country, regardless of the past, regardless of the fact that we were all neighbors and friends and family, intermixed families, that there was a legitimate reason to stop that from happening, and it didn't happen. So Ukraine is not part of NATO, and based on the location where Ukraine is, and after it withdrew from Russia in 1991 from the Soviet Union, I can understand why it would be a difficult decision to join the West, or because you're right there. And then back to the arsenal issue, the Soviet Union during the Cold War established its all of the nuclear things in all the republics, neighboring republics, essentially. I never even saw it as an option that Putin would let it go, because why? I mean, that's where the arsenal was. And so, yes, I could see how strategically he was concerned that now being on the side of Ukraine, that they still had nuclear weapons, or at least access to them, including nuclear facilities like Chernobyl and such. Yes, there's some strategy to this as well, and this is another issue with the American government. You have to be super careful, because you can't get into Ukraine with the American troops or even close to it, because you're waging a World War III.
Right.
And then the American troops would be sent. Like, again, my friend would say, why should our soldiers, our men and women, be sent to another country to die for somebody else's freedom, when we have our own problems here and we have to defend our own country as well?
Yeah.
It makes no sense strategically for the West, well, for America, because the West, NATO had really had an opportunity to step in, even help the Russian side for that matter, if they needed to at the time back in 2014. But they were just silent. They were just hiding behind it all. And watching this whole thing unravel for a long, long time. So
Yeah.
I think
So
Putin
what
was
about
provoked, but
from a faith question, and I guess you don't know, this is just, I would say, your best guess. It has been conjectured that part of what Putin is doing is religious in nature by wanting to sort of reunite Eastern Orthodoxy, which sort of was centered in Kiev. Is that possible?
Well, Kiev was definitely in existence for a long time before Russia was established, and was kind of considered to be the part of Russia, but Russia was very different at the time, Rus. And again, if you look at the history, it goes way back, and then we're talking about the Slavic people, and then the Uralic people moving from the north, and people from Scandinavia, and all of that movement that went on did join a lot of the people together. And yes, at one point, Yaroslav established Christianity, and but we're talking about biblical history almost, because one of the disciples essentially I think his one of his churches is still in Kiev, Andre, the one of the disciples. That becomes a very pivotal historical biblical site. My husband and I visited what it's called the Kievsky Pechorskaya Lavra, and it's a beautiful, gorgeous site. It's one of the largest Orthodox churches in the whole continent there. I can see how Putin would want it back, because
it's a badge, it's a trophy.
And the reason I say back is because during the Soviet Union, it was one country, whether you like it or not. And I grew up with friends from all over the republics. One of my best friends, Irina, she's from Kiev. She would come and visit me every single summer because of the Chernobyl situation. They would send children deep into Russia. And so I grew up with her, and she would speak Ukrainian to me, and I'd speak Russian to her, and we got along. And at this point, I have no idea where she is. So I'm assuming that this war affected her, because last I checked, she was still in Kiev. So yeah, it's again, culturally for us, people today are starting to really separate, Russian and Ukrainians, and that's true. They're very separate countries today. They are, but we have similar roots as far as everybody who's born today. We all grew up in the Soviet Union at the time, including Zelensky. So I'm heartbroken to see that people are starting to really develop a lot of hatred between the two nations as a result of this war. But that's what I keep saying, I keep appealing. If you look at it realistically, we were all the same people. And we were united by that travesty of the Soviet Union. Yes, we were. And 1917, when the Tsar and his family were taken, in fact, back to the Ural region, and they were executed in 1918, that was a huge travesty as well. For Soviet leadership to be established to take down the monarchy by killing the entire family, making sure that they have no relatives left, that's quite a murderous, homicidal inkling that they demonstrated from the very beginning. People who were led, the majority, it's like the woke culture today. It's like the mob mentality. They just stormed the Winter Palace, and they essentially destroyed all the art and everything they could. That doesn't make sense either. And we're talking 1917 at the time. So what's happening today, again, is such a chaos. And I think people have become far more civilized to see that you can't fool people this way anymore. So now, with the help of the media, and we live in an electronic age. Again, I appeal to people to use critical thinking and to know the history.
Do you think that's, you're right. This is a hugely different time, even from since you immigrated here. Social media, the internet, it's changed so much. Even it was already starting back in the 90s. They said, most of the information about Tiananmen Square that got out by a fax machine, via fax machines, which was a new technology then, and now we have so much more. Do you think this is could be like an Achilles heel for the Putin regime? Do you think there's more information available to the Russian people than they realize?
Oh, yes, definitely there's more information, which is one of the reasons lots of censorship went on very quickly, which also leads me to the next concept of the sanctions on Russia, because I don't see this as a smart move at all. In fact, it's quite the Achilles heel for the Americans. Why? Because first thing you want to do when you deal with an enemy is to know exactly what they're thinking. And by shutting everything down, by distancing oneself, you're also ostracizing the people who are actually suffering as a result. Although a lot of Russians are pretty hardy, so they say, you know what, we've been through this before where we've been sanctioned by our own government, so we'll survive, but that doesn't mean that they're happy about it.
Right.
Now, Ukrainians, of course, are facing a terrible disaster with the actual war being broken out in their land, and that's a whole different situation. And should we help? Like, anybody as a human being should be helping anybody who's struggling right now, which is what I don't understand what happened in Afghanistan. How could our administration, how could our administration actually abandon, including Americans,
Yeah. I don't.
allow them to take
Well,
over? That's absolutely no.
uh,
Except I would say it's treason.
I kind of equate it to a cult mentality and those who don't
Yeah.
understand the cult mentality. Because if, let's say you're a Jehovah's Witness, for example, you are taught regularly that Christendom is evil and they are out to harm you. They want you to believe in false gods. They will take away your ability to think. And we are here to help you to think the proper thoughts about God. And if you leave this organization, once you get outside, your life is going to just fall apart. It'll be chaotic. So you're kind of terrified about that.
Mhm.
Now, in this sense, what happens in Russia, if you're kind of taught that the West is evil,
Mhm.
and you've already indicated that he sent out things like that, and they get into this conflict, which the average Russian doesn't really understand what's going on because they have sort of fake news going on. And then you find the West cutting you off from everything.
Exactly. That's my point too.
Doesn't that sort of solidify the claims of the Russian leadership that the West is evil, is going to punish you because they're just an evil country?
Yes, and that's precisely my point, because uh, when I had a little bit more communication with the Russian side, a little bit more open, one of the first questions people were asking, what's happening with Afghanistan? How can your leader do this? And very shortly after Putin invaded Ukraine, he strategically planned this for a long time. Putin is like not 8, he's 20 steps ahead in this chess game of his. He's very strategic about it. Again, yes, he certainly knew what he was doing. So he saw weakness in our administration, and so it was very easy for him to now deceive and dupe people in Russia by saying, "I told you so. Look what's going on."
Right.
And then some of the stuff I translated for my friends, and I said, if you read it on the Russian news, it's very, very legit. It sounds very much convincing, and it could be
mm,
partly true, could be 90% true.
mhm.
That Zelensky created this chaos so that basically nobody can really tell the difference. Like, for example, the Russian news would report that Zelensky released all the violent prisoners and gave them guns, and then when they would go and rape and pillage and murder, then he would say the Russians did it. And so they're building a case against Zelensky back, in Russia right now, saying he's going to answer for these war crimes. Well, and then of course, look at the Ukraine,
Okay.
the opposites, like the Russians did it, and the reports were even several years ago. It was reported that Zelensky would actually have, or his people would have people come, take people out of morgue, the cadavers, throw them around, and say, "Look what the Russians did." So, how do we know the truth? it's very difficult because
Right.
our technology.
Especially if you only have one source. If
Yeah.
you are in a country where there's only one source.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening to Russia now, because people are basically not allowed to be on Facebook, WhatsApp, and there are some ways to communicate with the folks, but it's pretty much censored. And that's my concern. Why would the West want to cut off Russia, the 146 million people who pretty much almost everybody's against this war? People were boycotting and protesting on the streets. They're being thrown into jail. I've
Right.
watched the documentaries of this.
So you think the majority?
Done this to me too.
You think the majority are against it in Russia?
Well, they were certainly against the invasion, yes, but right now
Okay.
what's going on, everybody's fearful because they're being affected. The fact that McDonald's is pulled out, well, okay, that's not a big deal. But the fact that people are being lied to and then possibly being drafted into the military, that's a big deal, because we're talking about all the Ukrainians are dying right now, and the Russian current soldiers.
Yeah.
Who's going to die next? The blood
And
has to be stopped, and how do you stop it?
this is why I asked the question earlier. How does Putin survive this politically? Because when this is over,
I don't see how he would.
all these soldiers are going to come back and say, I didn't think I was going there to kill Ukrainians. I thought I was going there to liberate them. I thought they were going to welcome us.
The report, and again, I could send you links of pretty brutal videos, and I even had people from other neighboring countries would send me links and say, well, look at what the Russians are saying. And I said, and I listened to this, and I'm sorry, these are not Russians, these are Ukrainian soldiers are saying this, and they're insurgents. And within the first few days, why? Because they speak Russian language. So there's a lot of confusion.
So let me go to a faith question if I can, because you're a believer, and there are those in your family and friendships in the Soviet Union and maybe in the Ukraine who are believers. From a faith standpoint, how are they approaching this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I said it earlier. I personally, and my friends and whom I've talked to, we're all in tremendous shock. We spent days on end, probably just crying our eyes out, and even just to start thinking back, because it was unbearable to see this happening. This is happening literally to friends, family, places we walked and lived. But I also watched some of my friends become very, very hardened in their hearts, and they're Christians, and I appeal to them to do what the Bible says, what Jesus said, and that is to pray for our enemies. I heard pastors pray that the Russian planes fall out of the sky, and I thought, no, we don't want that. We want to pray for our enemies. Why? Because, like you said, if they come to their senses, especially if they become Christians, I think it would be harder for them to follow those orders. So I see why Christ would say that. So I've had some intellectual conversations trying to reason with some of my friends, and some of them were very much, under the influence of what they've been through, because some of them have to escape, and they're in a lot of shock and a lot of trauma. So it's very, very difficult to reason with anybody right now. There's a lot of sense of hatred going on, and that's what propels this war, and that's what makes me sick to my stomach to think that our leaders, on whichever side they are, I'm not picking on Zelensky right now because I could see that he's definitely stuck in the situation, but I think he could have avoided certain things in the past, and so I think he needs to kind of.
What do you think he could have done better?
He could have asked the West for help. You don't have to join NATO to ask your neighbors to assist when he had problems in his own land. And that
You mean years earlier?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because this has been going on since 2014, really.
Right. So he should have done something about it. So as I said, Putin was provoked, but it's like, you don't poke the bear.
That's what we've been hearing lately.
And people don't, if those who don't like Trump, here's the thing. Trump kind of pacified Putin. He knew not to antagonize a wasp's nest. That's just common sense. And so unfortunately, our current administration allowed a lot of this to happen because of hubris, because of arrogance.
So you're still friends with Ukrainians, right?
Yes, of course.
Oh yeah, this hasn't. My sister-in-law, my youngest brother's wife, is second generation Ukrainian American, and I got a text about a week into the conflict that 17 of her male relatives had been inducted into the Ukrainian army, and it just brought home how well in the Chicago area we have a lot of Ukrainian Americans, and I remember talking to them back in the 80s, and they really, this is of course way before the fall of the Berlin Wall and communism, and there was I never detected a kind of hatred or anything for Russians, but the Soviet government was definitely an adversary to them. And it seems that now the Russian government has taken the place of that. So they understand it's between governments, not between peoples. It seems that Russians and Ukrainians are like the closest of brothers and sisters.
Yeah, there are a lot of families, I know that wife's Russian, the husband's Ukrainian, will remake the child. They live part-time in Ukraine, part-time in Russia. That's very typical. Same with publics. And yeah, I worked for 10 years as a medical interpreter, mainly medical, sometimes social and court. And majority of my clients were Ukrainians because they were they sought asylum in the United States because of political reasons, not even religious, but political reasons. And you would think it would be because of Chernobyl, but no, it was because of the government. And I never ever had any problems with any of my clients on that sense in the medical field. So yeah, this is all happening. This is an internal war basically, and it's a war inside the family.
Yeah.
Le Régénéres brings up an interesting point with our, he writes it this way, with our insane pride parades, stupid Hollywood elites, weak leaders, it's almost impossible for America to claim any moral high ground. I would say the same is true with abortions, etc. I think that that's true. It's hard to claim moral high ground when you have a nation that has turned so completely against biblical morality.
Well, Solzhenitsyn said, "We're misusing our freedom." He came over here after he was released, and all of the Yale and Harvard elites got their knickers in a twist when he dared to criticize American culture and how it used its freedom. Well, this is what the guy does. He looks at the culture around him and he gives you an evaluation, and he happened to be spot on in both cases. He wasn't maybe as hard on America, but they couldn't even deal with it that he was the least bit critical, and we deserved it.
Well, he said that, if you pathologize yourself and you allow others to do so, you pathologize in the entire society. And that's the only time you can call evil good. So that's he saw what was going on inside his own camp where he was a victim of for 20 years. And when he came here, of course, it's the same thing I see. Same people from Poland, you're saying, or people from Ukraine, when they came here, they were very concerned. And say it's not a Christian nation. Well, it's true, it's not a Christian nation, but it was very much established Judeo-Christian values.
Well, it is, and I'm glad you pointed out. That's what Claude Aviles had pointed out. It is true that it's not a Christian nation, but it is also true that until very recently, within the last 20 years, it held to a Judeo-Christian morality as its guide. That doesn't mean they were Christians. They weren't. It doesn't mean it didn't live badly. Many of them did. It doesn't mean that there were not practicing homosexuals. There were. It does mean that generally, the general view was a Christian, Judeo-Christian morality and ethos. Since around 2000 or so, the Christian hangover we had has worn off.
The hangover. Was it that bad?
Well, it kind of was, because and Ron, we've written on this extensively over the
Yeah.
last 30 years, going from a Judeo-Christian morality, Western culture, to back to first century, whatever you want to believe and however you want to behave is okay. So we we went through a period where we had left Christianity, still had a Judeo-Christian morality, so I call that the Christian hangover. That wore off in as we entered the third millennium, pretty much wore off, and now we're seeing the fruits of all of that in the behavior of our nation and other nations, because it's not just the U.S., it's other Western cultures that are adopting the same framework, which then makes it difficult. How do you say what Putin is doing is morally wrong? By what standard are you using?
Yeah, you're very correct to point that out, because, and again, having followed the news for some time back in Russia, while I was here following the news that were going on in Russia, um, Putin actually tried to establish Christianity as a state religion, and then he had some pushback from the Muslims and some other people, and so he didn't. But historically, Russia has been a Christian nation, Orthodox, again, for quite a few centuries. So it makes sense to say for them that yes, those are the moral standards that they go by, even if it's nominal. The Soviet Union obviously took out that concept, so he tried to restore some of it. So Vladimir Putin has an image of a person who has very good, solid core. Again, having coming back from the Soviet Union regime and establishing Russia, and now he's taking it back to the Soviet regime because he's been in power for 22 years. People forget that. He changed the
So,
constitution. He had Medvedev put in for a while, and then he was also a former KGB director. So I see that happening in him. I don't know why. There could be a number of reasons, but I think that he just like
well,
Trudeau,
Cla-
he was exercising his power now to the fullest.
Claude made another point, and I want to pick up on this before we start wandering away. Tell it to 67 plus aborted babies. There is
Maybe
reason enough
67
for God,
million.
million, yeah, for God to judge and remove the USA from the planet. Now, I have pointed out to some, when they sort of bemoan what we see going on today, that they're concerned about why we're suffering. Is God punishing the U.S.? I point out, it wasn't that long ago I heard many Christians saying, if God doesn't punish the U.S. for just abortions alone, much less other things, then he owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now that it's actually happening, they're shocked that it is happening. Is God judging the nation? I don't know. The truth is, I don't know. He hasn't given me any kind of revelation. We don't have living prophets today that I can find that says God is bringing judgment and here's why. But if I were to guess, it looks an awful like judgment to me.
Mm-hmm.
Just my guess.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great topic for next time if you guys want to invite my husband over, because
Oh,
he can talk on the issue of eschatology. And I think that a lot of this would be very, very clear then, because ultimately, prophetically, we know there will be a judgment on the whole world. So whether the
Well,
miracle will be here or not, it'll get the spanking if it is. And
yeah.
the Christians should be gone by then. So
Well,
it'll
uh,
take place.
we can talk about that off the air, because we, even Ron and I, don't agree on some of the areas of eschatology, and we like each other anyway, and we want to keep it that way.
It's still like
So,
my husband too then.
we'll talk about it. It sounds interesting. It's piqued
it
my interest. So,
could pique your interest, and I could sit back and just watch you two go at it.
well, I'll try
Irina,
to.
what should we pray for as we get ready to part company for the day?
Well, just like it's been on my heart ever since day one, ever since I got communication from the Russian side, and people were horrified and saying, "How are you doing with all of this?" We do have to pray for our eyes to be open, all nations, if we can, and see the true, instigators of this problem, and also realize that again, we do live in difficult times, but also different times, and I think we need to pray for one another more than ever, and that is to even pray for our enemies.
Okay, so we need to pray for the leaders of all three nations for sure, and other leaders. We need to pray for those who are suffering in both countries, Russia and Ukraine. You have family there in both sides, as you point out, and friends, so we want to pray for them. And pray for us as well, that we stay focused on the faith first and foremost, regardless of what the governments do.
And I'd say there are a lot of fearful people in Europe right now. I have a friend who lives on the Brittany coast of France. I talk to her every couple of weeks, and she's afraid. I mean, and I have to believe that if she is, there must be a lot of others. And she tells me, yeah, there are a lot of people who are fearful.
Oh, there's to be so, yes, because we don't know what's going to happen next. It's definitely attack. Yeah. Cold War is at the door, if not World War III.
Ron, would you care to waltz us out of here?
Waltz, you would like a waltz? Well, let's give credit to whom and to where credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamus. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur, special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yola Cullen. Technical assistance comes from Rookie Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping, and original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never, ever. Not today, not ever. And now we do the royal wave as we waltz out of here.